ну типа того, и беременеть на продолжение всех годов возможных. С результатом. Ну я к примеру говорю, да. Ну не так что ли? Жизнь женского, хорошо, какая тогда жизнь женского? Я тебе сказал уже, то есть количество детей, которые да, ну, если замужние. Не замужние, это значит около того, но не туда попали, да, понимает. Это оно и есть. Оно, да, да. Как это неряха, что значит? Неважно, выполнять, да. Не суть разговора. То есть жизнь, вот ее живи, и все. Все, что может быть. Да, наверное. Чтобы дня не работать, надо беременеть всю жизнь. Но только настоящее, только все это будет жизнь. Только людским милосердием может это жить. Нужное будешь мне. Самой себе не нужное, конечно, это же пацан просто. Раздражаешь уже, просто скажи, да, ну, короче, как хочешь. Женская жизнь тоже живут, это пусть это останется на потом, да, меня не касается. То есть жизнь женского организма, женщинам тоже можно жить жизнь к их несчастью, можно добавить. Или что. Ну, на самом деле, это наоборот, наверное, да. Да, ну, наверное. Да. И радоваться какими-то радостями, да. И за чужой счет у тебя так раз мороженку дали, ой, ну, и так раз мороженку дали и осеменили. Все нормально, как говорится, ну, меня не касается. Ладно, все, проехали. Да, к тому, что женская жизнь, она вот из этого, и оно и совпадает со всем хорошим, со счастьем, то есть она идеальна для женщин самих, потому что они не мужчины. Поэтому женская жизнь для них идеально, понимаешь, подходит. Больше все, если они ее живут назад, и как бы назад, тогда вообще ничего вообще просто тоже немножко не Hungary, Hungary. Да. Ну вот. Ну вот, я понимаю, что ты тоже смотрю, когда... Ладно. Что такое? Толку нету. Да. Вот это и бонусовый, да. Village. Ух ты, да. Посмотри, вот овощ ты же убиваешь его, то есть капуста это, понимаешь, мы ее убили. Да, то есть капуста тебя ненавидит за это, она понимает. Яблоки тебя не будут ненавидеть, как ты сам считаешь, ну, наверное. Ну, или как думаешь, я не знаю. Да нет, это понятно, это просто как бы, да, тело самого, какого еще духа. Ну, шутка твоя не сказала, просто все. Да, кто-то меня за язык что ли тянул, просто так, да. Сообщение. Вот это нет, наоборот. Да, вот это она имеет в виду. Ну да. Ну и как стать независимой за себя, как это, да. Да, вот. Как жить эмоционально насыщенной жизнью женской, понимаешь? Ты это имеешь в виду? Надо быть на обеспечении. Да, понимаешь. То, что, да, я тоже, да, вот видишь? Да. Ну наоборот, да. Да, ну вот это есть эмоционально, да. И все, чувствуй, что тебе вообще, что в голову придет, и чувствуй, да. И от этого все захотят тебя, это самое. Ну не все, а все захотят тебя от этого, да. Да, то есть он про себя так думает, да. Вот это он имеет в виду. Да, наоборот, да. Вот это он имеет в виду. Да. Ну да. Эй, где? Ага. Выручка завтра бывает, да? Да, себе. Да.
Let us begin then with the subject of today, which is the fugue. Every educated person should know what a fugue is. Why? Because it's an intellectual model, an intellectual paradigm that surfaces in a number of disciplines. For example, in poetry, oddly, if you've ever peeked at T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets, the structure of a fugue is referenced there frequently. If you go to literature, a novel written about the same time, Aldous Huxley's Point Counterpoint, it's framed in the shape of a fugue. We could go to geology. Geologists occasionally will say, this particular crystal has a fugue-like structure to it, turning to painting. There are painters of the 20th century, I can name at least three, Franz Kupka, Henri Valence, and Joseph Albers, who used to be the dean of our own School of Art and Architecture. They all painted fugues, and we will be looking at Albers' fugue, which actually happens to be in your textbook when we come to section this week. So be sure to bring your textbooks to section this week because we will be using them. I'm interested in the fugue also because of this book, Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach. Oh my, it's heavy. Mine, I didn't bring in my copy. This is the Bass copy that Linda was kind enough to pull over. Mine is a paperback. It's not this heavy. But in a way, this is indicative because it's heavy reading. Anybody ever peeked at this book and any other? Good. Is it Adam? Yeah, Adam. What course did you read this in? Recommended by friends. I can follow about the first 25 or 30 pages or so. Then when it gets to the math, it really gets over my head. But what it is an attempt to use the fugue as a way of bringing a common mode of understanding to the visual arts, to mathematics, and to music. The musician that is foregrounded here, of course, is J.S. Bach, the master of the fugue. So we want to know about how fugues operate. So let's take a look at the specifics here. The term fugue actually comes from an old Latin word, fuga, which means flight or to fly. So in a fugue, what you get is one voice going ahead, leading ahead, and another voice following it. Now I just used the term voice there. Fugues can be written for actual voices, sounding voices, or they can be written for instruments such as the violin or the cello, individual lines. They can even be written for instruments that can play several lines or several parts at once. The piano can do that, the organ can do that, even the guitar, and occasionally the violin will be asked to do that. Fugues have been written for as few as 2 voices. Yes, you can have a 2-voice fugue up to as many as 32 voices. And they can be, as mentioned, written for, and they are best perhaps performed on these keyboard instruments that have the capacity to play many lines, many parts, many voices at once. The greatest collection of fugues, as you may have bumped into, heard about, or at least heard the term, is this collection of preludes and fugues by J.S. Bach called the Well-Tempered Clavier. First of all, what's a prelude? It's just a warm-up piece. You sort of get relaxed, you get to see your fingers, get a feel of the keyboard or of the lute or whatever it might happen. It would be a prelude, a pre-play, a warm-up. And then we go on to the meat of the issue, which is the fugue. Now, why is this called the well-tempered clavier? Anybody know? Anybody have? It's an odd term. Clavier just means keyboard, the well-tuned keyboard. Thoughts there? Well, what was going on in Bach's day is that they didn't have a keyboard they didn't have a tuning system in which all of the pitches were exactly a half step apart. Some were slightly closer together, and then others farther apart. And the key of C actually had a slightly different sound than the key of D. And it's only in the 18th and 19th century that we gradually shifted from an unequal keyboard to an equally tuned keyboard. So Bach is kind of part of this transition to the equal tuned keyboard. He was getting close to the equal temperament of the modern keyboard. And that's why he called it the well-tuned keyboard. And by tuning it this way, it allows you to modulate to all keys. And that's what he did in this collection. He wrote 2 books, one in about 1722 when he was in Curtin, and another about 1742 when he was in Leipzig. And in each of these books, we have a total of 24 preludes and fugues. One prelude and fugue in C major, one prelude and fugue in C minor, one prelude and fugue in C sharp major, and one prelude and fugue in C sharp minor, and so on it goes, all the way up the keyboard and that kind of 2 books of it. And this is kind of standard fodder for those that want to become professional musicians. Okay, so that's what that is about the well-tempered clavier. We've been referencing Bach here, and nobody, of course, wrote better fugues than J.S. Bach. Some continued to write fugues. Mozart wrote some fugues, Haydn wrote some fugues, Beethoven wrote some fugues, and so on. And even into the 20th century, we have a few composers. Paul Hindemith, who used to teach at Yale, Dmitri Shostakovich, they wrote fugues. But generally speaking, the fugue has its heyday in the Baroque period, roughly 1600 to 1750, the heyday of Bach and Handel. How do fugues work? Well, they start out, as mentioned, with one voice leading forward, and then another voice imitates that voice. Exactly. Now, if that following voice, here's a question, if that following voice imitated the leader exactly from beginning to end, what would we have? A round. Okay, good. That's what we would have, a round. Or we could use the fancier music word, a canon. Canon, round, the same thing. One voice imitating the other exactly from beginning to end. But in a fugue, what happens is, after the main idea, which we'll be calling the subject, the main idea is stated, then the parts go their independent ways, generating counterpoint. But they're not exact, they're not precise duplications of the rhythms and the pitches of the leaders. So what we could do would be to visualize this in a sort of crude way. Up here, you have a leader and then a follower. And the follower duplicates the main idea, which we're going to call the subject, for a period of time, but then it kind of breaks off. So voices will come in and duplicate a certain amount of material and then break off and go their own way. So that's a good way of thinking of the beginning of a fugue, which we will call the exposition. I'll come back to that point in a moment. Notice here I put a silly little tree up here. We could say that we have the the genus polyphony here. We've got monophonic texture, homophonic texture, and polyphonic texture. So within polyphonic texture, we have non-imitative texture, and then a stream of imitative polyphony, and then two forms of imitative polyphony. Rather strict, exactly strict imitative polyphony, the canon, and less strict imitative polyphony, the fugue. Okay, questions about that so far? All right, let's go back to the beginning of the fugue. You have this opening melody, the distinctive part of it, which we're going to call the subject. That's just what we call the melody in a fugue, the subject. And the way this works is, in a fugue, each of the voices in turn will come in with that subject. One will start out, and another will come in, then another will come in. After all of the voices are in, we're at the end of what we call the exposition of the fugue. Now, we've had the term exposition before, and where was that? Over there, Elizabeth, I hear you. Yeah, sonata form, sonata allegro form. So and what do we mean by exposition there? Well, it's a chance where you present all the themes. We talked about first theme, the second theme, closing theme. If you're in a fugue, we have just one theme, but everybody's going to get a chance to present it. And after everyone has a chance to present it, every voice has a chance to present it, then we're finished with the exposition. All the voices have exposed the theme in their range. After that, we go on to what's called the episode of a fugue. What happens in an episode? Well, usually it modulates key. And the vehicle through which composers frequently modulate is melodic sequence, either up or down. You can kind of move around by using sequence. You can get to different places by using sequence. So it tends to be a contrapuntal because it's using little motives from the theme. It modulates, moves around a lot, goes to different keys, sounds a bit unsettled. If we were to think back on sonata allegro form and try to find an analog for sonata allegro form in the fugue episode, what would it be? What is the episode of the fugue like in sonata allegro form? Roger? Exactly, the development section. So these episodes in a fugue are sort of mini development sections. So visualize, if you will. We start out here with the exposition, in which all voices present the subject. Then you have this kind of free period in which the motive out of the subject is played with, developed, moved around different pitches. Then the subject will come back in a new key, because we've modulated in the episode. And subject in just one voice, new key. Then another episode in which there's modulation, more counterpoint, more movement. Another statement of the subject in a new key. Another episode, another statement of the subject, and on it goes until we run out of energy, usually about after 4 or 5 minutes or so, at which point the composer will bring the subject back, maybe in the bass or in the soprano in a very prominent range, in the tonic key, and have a sense, this is a very solid moment. Yes, this fugue is ending. It may be a statement, because it's kind of free period in which many development sections. So visualize, if you will. We start out here with the exposition, in which all voices present the subject. Then you have this kind of free period in which the motive out of the subject is played with, developed, moved around different pitches. Then the subject will come back in a new key, because we've modulated in the episode. And subject in just one voice, new key. Then another episode in which there's modulation, more counterpoint, more movement. Another statement of the subject in a new key. Another episode, another statement of the subject, and on it goes until we run out of energy, usually about after 4 or 5 minutes or so, at which point the composer will bring the subject back, maybe in the bass or in the soprano in a very prominent range, in the tonic key, and we have a sense, this is a very solid moment. Yes, this fugue is ending. And maybe they'll throw one or two chords on at the end, but that's it. So it's a complex form, but maybe not quite as complex as sonata allegro form. What's a definition, and if you're taking notes there, what's a definition of a fugue? Well, I wrote a definition of a fugue, and I will read the definition out of the textbook. Students don't like this, I found, if you read out of a textbook. But I ought to be able to do this since I wrote the textbook, okay? So I'm going to read a good definition of a fugue here. Definition of a fugue. A composition for 2, 3, or 4 parts, played or sung by voices or instruments, which begins with a presentation of a subject, in imitation in each part. The exposition continues with modulating passages of free counterpoint, the episodes, and further appearances of the subject, and ends with a strong affirmation of the tonic key. Well, you can't write all that down, but if you want to just put in your notes for definition of fugue, see page 144 of the text. Fortunately, as I say, it's easier to hear and look at fugues than it is to define them. All right, now, today we're going to do something different. It's the only day in our course where we're actually going to look at music, okay? We've handed out music for you, an entire piece, an entire fugue by J.S. Bach here. And ideally, I guess we'd be in a seminar format, and we'd all be standing around the piano here. So my first question for you is, for how many voices is this fugue written? Look at just the first page and look vertically and see what's the maximum number of pitches you have sounding simultaneously at any one moment. Caroline, is it? 3, okay? Yeah, we have 3. If you look through there sometimes at the very beginning there's just one voice, and then there are 2 voices, and then there are 3 voices, 3 lines. But it never gets to be more than 3 lines. So we have our exposition here, and it consists of 3 statements of the subject. We're going to call these 3 voices, or 4 lines, the alto, the soprano, and the bass, which comes in bar 7 there. So here's the little bit at the beginning of it. So that's our exposition, because each of the voices, alto, soprano, and bass, has come in and presented the subject. Then we have bars 9 and 10 here. What's that? If I just go... It's a melodic sequence, and which direction is it going, up or down? Well, that's hard, maybe harder than you think. Really going down, not because the line is going down, but we're starting each time on a successively lower pitch. And this sequence takes us. So we've started in this kind of tonality, which is minor, but now by the time we've gotten to bar 10 and 11 particularly, it's modulated. So that's what our little episode was in bars 9 and 10 there. It allowed us to move from a minor key to a major key. And now the subject comes back in, and as you can see, what voice is it in there? What voice is the subject in bar 11? Pretty straightforward. Somebody yell it out? Soprano, okay? So here, heads up in the soprano. Statement of the theme in a major in the soprano. What happened in that little episode? We were here, and now we're here. Modulated again to minor, and there in bar 15, where's the subject? this in the alto part. That's an interesting moment there, because we've got a three-voice fugue. And how many hands does the performer have? Obviously two. So at some moments, these hands are going to have to share a subject. And that's what happens in that voice. When you play this, take a look there, the very last measure of that page. It must be 15. Starts out, my left hand is playing here. And then the left hand has to get out and pick up the counterpoint in the bass, and the right hand takes over that subject. Job of the pianist there, or the keyboardist, who's ever playing it, to really lean on the inside of your hand there. Because when you normally play these instruments, there's a tendency, and I'm sure Santana's a far better keyboardist than I will confirm this, there's a tendency to roll to either side. It's easier to play bass and soprano. What's hard to do is to get those inner voices, so that the keyboard player has to, and then then that wasn't a good performance. All right, now that takes us across the page there. We're now back in a minor key. This is bar 16 and 17. And bar 17, 18, 19, beginning of 20, we have an interesting moment. It's called invertible counterpoint. What do we mean by that? Well, he has a motive. We're going to call that motive A. And he has another motive, motive B. So there's B in the alto, A in the bass. And together they sound sort of like this. Okay? Cool. Now, next three bars, what happens? Well, he takes B. He takes B and puts that below A. He's switching the positions here. A is now. Both of these motives are coming up in rising sequence. So let's go back to the beginning of 17 there, and we'll listen to the switch. So that goes by very quickly, right? How long do you think it took Bach to figure that out? I don't know. He's a very good contrapuntist. Maybe boom, like that. I'd have to sit there, Santana, how long would it take you to figure out some invertible counterpoint? You could think up one melody, think up another melody that would be a harmony against it, but yet you could flip the two, and it would still sound pretty darn good. It takes a long time to kind of work that out. So that's what's kind of neat about fugue. There's all these intricacies embedded in them that almost sail by the general listener unless we happen to have the music right in front of us and can dwell on them. All right, so that takes us over now to bar 20, where we are here back, I guess, in our tonic key of C minor, and the theme is up in the soprano. Final statement in the soprano. A couple of interesting points there. When we concluded this piece, we had this sound. That's a little bit surprising about that. We're ending with these. It's called the fugue number 2 in C minor. We are ending here with This is a standard gambit from the late 16th right through the 18th century. Last chord, they didn't like the end pieces in minor. Maybe it's too depressing or whatever. I don't want to do that. So, with the major third of the oboe. That's called a Picardy third. Maybe from the old French word picard, which means sort of sharp or pointed. So we have a pointed ending there. We have a major ending. Here's another issue when we're all, since we're on the topic of points, and that's called a pedal point. What was J.S. Bach known as in his day? Was he known as a great composer? What is he known as? How do you learn it basically? How do you learn it moving? He played the eVGENIY more, yeah. He played the organ. He was the great organ virtuoso of his day. And I think at the end of this particular fugue here, it's interesting. He just has that line sit there. Okay, on the organ, that would just be fine and dandy, because you put your foot down there on that low C and la, and that tonic note would continue to hold. But if you were writing this for the clavichord or the harpsichord or the piano, what happens to that sound once you hit it? It dies away. I think in the end of this piece here, Bach had the sound of the organ. He wasn't thinking, gee, if this is really for a harpsichord or something, I better write this like this. So we get a nice, strong tonic sound at the end. He may have had the sound of the organ there in his ear. But perhaps the important point here is this idea of a pedal point, because we've actually even talked about that before in the Johannes Brahms variation on the theme of Haydn, which was performed Saturday night. Pedal point is what? Anybody can define pedal point for me? Well, what goes on? It's pretty simple. Roger? Yeah, the bass holds a note, and basically you're just kind of running over top of one, possibly two harmonies up above it, but it all sounds consonant. So just be sure of the idea of one note, usually in the bass, just holding for a long period of time. Let me turn the volume up here. Okay, any questions about that fugue by J.S. Bach? Anybody want to ask anything about that? Marcus, that works for you? Ugona, okay? Thaddeus, no questions? Frederick? Okay, good. Yeah, thanks for bringing that out. There at the end, we could even have, you're right, 4, maybe even 5 notes played at once. So this idea that once you have 3 parts, you can only have 3 parts. So once you have a 5-voice fugue, you can have no more than 5 voices. Breaks down at the very end. Why would you imagine a composer would want to do that thing? Well, no, it's not that hard, because once you get used to the idea of a C major triad, a musician would look at that end and say, I just got a C major triad, I'm going to just bang down it. So that's not hard technically or intellectually. But why would a composer, you raised a very interesting point here, why would a composer want to add more notes at the end? I think it's a pretty straightforward idea. Michael. Yeah, just make it louder, make it more sonorous, bang ending sort of thing. Yeah, to tell the listener once again that this is something special that will probably at the end. All right, so let's listen to just a bit of this. We've had one version of this. Let's listen to a contemporary jazz ensemble playing. It starts out with a kind of guitar synthesizer with a piano here, and then we'll see what the other instruments are. Here's a jazz rendition of the same fugue by Bach.